Good morning. As he landed, he saw a great throng, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's from Mark 6 and Matthew 9. Jesus said, "Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That's Matthew 10 and Matthew 15. So he told them this parable: "Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it?" That's Matthew 18 and Luke 15. "Do not be scared, my little flock, because your Father has delighted to give you the kingdom." That's Luke 12. "I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves." Matthew 10. "All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people out from one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left." From Matthew 25. "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered." That's Matthew 26 and Mark 14. "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." From John chapter 10, just read a moment ago. "Now may the God of peace, who brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant." It's Hebrews 13. "Do not lord it over those in your charge, but be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will win the crown of glory that never fades away." That's 1 Peter 5. "For you were wandering as sheep, but you have now turned back to the shepherd and teacher of your souls." 1 Peter 2. "Standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands, they cried out in a loud voice, saying, 'Salvation belongs to our God, who is seated on the throne, and to the Lamb.'" It's Revelation 7. There are lots of metaphors in the Bible. The Bible very seldomly wants to tell us exactly what God is. The Bible wants to tell us that God is like this, and then God is like that. And so sometimes we'll get God is a mighty fortress, or God is a mighty tower, or God is a rock, or God is like a mother hen who wants to protect her brood, or God is a roaring lion, or God is Father, or God is King, or God is Teacher, or God is Shepherd. Like all metaphors, it is dangerous when we absolutize any one of them. We just latch on rock. God's a rock, that's it, done. Well, what kind of rock? Is it marble or granite or, chalk? What are we talking about? Okay, God's granite. Well, what kind of granite? Which granite? That rock right there, that's God. No, you can't absolutize rock. You can't point to one tower or one mighty fortress and say God's that one over there. And we can't and shouldn't absolutize any of the other metaphors like Father or Shepherd or Teacher. They each of them in their own way help us get another little glimpse into who God is. But all the metaphors in the scriptures are also not all equal. Some we get once or twice, like mighty tower. But there are some of the metaphors that we see over and over again. And Jesus, God as shepherd, is one of the most abiding images and metaphors for God and for Jesus. I read a few of them from the New Testament. That was not an exhaustive list. I would still be reading if I did an exhaustive list. And that's just the New Testament. And then there's all of the Old Testament metaphors of God being as shepherd, like the 23rd Psalm, which we read a moment ago. There's also a bunch of the prophets from the Old Testament, when the prophets are railing against the kings of Israel and Judah who are doing terrible things. God will say, they are not good things, but I will send you a shepherd. You need a shepherd who will guide you. And of course, the king par excellence of the Old Testament is David. And what was David doing before he was a king? He was a shepherd. In the earliest days of the church, for the first 3.5 centuries of Christianity, the image, like when archaeologists dig up a chapel or a grave site or some place where Christians were gathering to worship or to baptize, and we find a fresco or we find a mosaic, in the first 3 centuries, the image that shows up over and over and again is Jesus as the shepherd. Jesus is depicted as a young fellow. He's got the robe that goes up to his knees, and you can sort of see his legs underneath that. It's a short tunic. You can see his arms, and he's got a belt around his waist, and he either has sheep below him, or he's carrying a sheep, or a sheep is on his shoulders being carried. We see this over and over again. And then art historians are amazed because by the middle of the 4th century, by the middle of the 300s, that image basically stops. For like 350 years, when we wanted to depict Jesus, our ancient forebears went to the shepherd again and again and again. After about 350, the shepherd just goes away and is replaced by image after image after image of Jesus the King. And so his robes get longer and fuller, and they're of rich colors, and sometimes he's seated, and sometimes he has like an orb and a scepter in his hand, and he's got a crown on his head, a bejeweled crown, not a crown of thorns, and his face oftentimes is stoic. It's just like that 1,000-yard stare. It's not the soft demeanor of the shepherd. It's the king who is judge and who is looking out over his kingdom. And of course, that shift happened because in the early 4th century, Christianity comes out of the catacombs, it comes out of the shadows, it's no longer illegal to be a Christian, and it becomes the official religion of the empire. And so Christianity becomes part of the empire, and so then the iconography of Jesus changes from the homely shepherd into the emperor who rules. And both images are biblical. We see God as king over and over again in the Old Testament. We see God and Jesus as king in the New Testament, just as we see Jesus and God presented as shepherd. But the ancient church, so focused on the shepherd, shifts its gaze to God and Jesus as king. You could think about the differences between these two figures. A king is not approachable at all. You don't approach a king. In fact, you may know the protocol if you have the fortune, good or otherwise, however you see it, of meeting the King of England. You may know you do not reach out your hand to shake his. If he would happen to reach out his hand to shake yours, then you're allowed to do it. But you don't touch the king unless you are bid. Seeing a king is a rare occurrence. We're going to be going to England this summer. We don't have any plans to see the king or anyone of the royal family. But if we do, I'm going to come back and that's all I'm going to talk about, because that's going to be amazing that we saw the king or a prince or a princess or something like that. A shepherd, on the other hand, in those days is not a rare occurrence at all. I know we don't live in New Zealand where there are sheep everywhere. We don't live in an area of the country where there's lots of sheep or shepherds. In fact, if we were driving through Jersey and we looked out and saw a field with a group of sheep and a shepherd walking, we would just slow the car down and gawk, like, oh my gosh, we saw a shepherd. But in Jesus' day, in the days of the Old Testament, the days of the New Testament, sheep and shepherds were common. They were everywhere. Today, you go to the Holy Land, there are sheep and shepherds that are everywhere. They are common. If you were here last night and heard our bishop preach, she mentioned that the teaching that Jesus gives today on I am the Good Shepherd, we know exactly where Jesus was when he delivered that sermon. He was at the gate leading into Jerusalem called the Sheep Gate. And it was called the Sheep Gate because there was a large pen there which held the sheep to be used for sacrifice in the temple. And so as Jesus is talking about being the Good Shepherd, the sheep are behind him bleeding, right there. It's a present image. The shepherd is close. The shepherd is seen. The shepherd, unlike the king, where the king is like rarely seen. You see him from a distance. Oh, I think that's him. The shepherd's everywhere. Jesus as our shepherd, God as our shepherd, is not the God who is distant, but the God who is close, the God who is seen, the God who we can touch, and the God who reaches out and touches us. How many of you have been to the National Cathedral in Washington? A good number, but a good number of you haven't been, and so get thee to Washington. And there's a lot of wonderful things to see in Washington. You gotta go to the National Cathedral. As Episcopalians, it's our national cathedral. It's our cathedral. It's the cathedral for the Diocese of Washington. It's the cathedral where the presiding bishop of the whole Episcopal Church has his seat. It was the idea behind it actually came from George Washington. George Washington wanted a house of prayer for all people. And so 120 years or so ago, a bunch of Episcopalians got together and said, we're going to build exactly that, a house of prayer for all people. And it is sort of the national house of prayer. And so when a president dies, or a senator dies, or an ambassador dies, or a Supreme Court justice dies, most often their funeral is held there in the National Cathedral. It's an incredibly grand and exquisite space. The main nave, the place where the people sit, can seat about 2,500 people, and it regularly sits about 2,500 people. People flock to it, pardon the pun. And if you go and you look straight ahead, you're sitting in the nave with 2,500 people, you look straight ahead, the image that you see in a white stone, limestone, huge, at the very end of the church is Jesus as king. And he is seated on that throne with an orb and a scepter. And he has that 1,000-yard stare. And up there in that grand, almost regal space, it makes sense. Jesus as king just fits right in. It is lovely and wonderful. And if you're able to walk up close to it, Jesus is larger than life. But then if you go downstairs to the crypt, which I know sounds creepy, but it's not. There's lots of beautiful little smaller chapels down there. There's the Jerusalem chapel, the Bethlehem chapel. And then there's this little tiny chapel that is called the Chapel of the Good Shepherd. And unlike the nave upstairs that sits 2,500, the Chapel of the Good Shepherd comfortably sits around 7 people. And there's no lights or chandeliers like there are upside. There's upstairs, there's one lancet window which allows some light to come in from the outside. And there's a very simple altar. And above the altar, there is this beautiful and almost homely statue of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, holding the sheep. If you're using the bulletin on your phone or device, I put a picture of that Good Shepherd right in line, right underneath where it says sermon. And if you look at it, you will notice that the hands of the Good Shepherd are darker than the rest of the statue. Anyone looking at that picture, can you tell me why those hands are darker? Huh? The shepherd works. The light's a little funky. People are touching it. You ever go to a museum where there's stonework and there's like signs everywhere, don't touch the stone? Because our fingers have oils and, believe it or not, acids, which affect stone. There is no sign in the chapel of the Good Shepherd that says, do not touch the stonework. And so people just go and they touch the shepherd. They hold on to the shepherd. They pray with the shepherd, and the mark of their prayers has bled into the hands of that shepherd. You almost can't imagine doing that with Christ the King in upstairs, but there in that little chapel with the shepherd close and near and right in front of you, you might just reach out and touch his hand. I want to finish with one last thing. I don't think I've ever shared this before, but it's a thing I've done as part of my prayer life for probably 25 years. As a priest, sometimes we get called into harrowing situations. We get a phone call and someone has died, or someone is about to die, or some terrible calamity has happened, or there's a difficult conversation with someone that has to be had that you really don't want to have, but I have to have. And there are some things as a priest you just sort of get used to, and you just sort of like, you be a priest for 20 years and you just do it. These kind of situations are never just, oh, I'm just doing it. They always affect. And so when I'm driving to the hospital or driving to the person's home, or I'm walking down the hallway, whatever it is, for 25 years, I have invited Jesus, the Good Shepherd, to be with me. And it's a visual prayer. And I picture Jesus right over my right shoulder, like right out of my field of vision, right behind me. And I know he has a soft expression on his face, and I know he has his crook in his hand, and I know that wherever I am going, I am not going alone. I offer that vision to you, because we all walk into tough situations. Sometimes really tough, sometimes daily tough, but Jesus is our King and our rock and our fortress and our crag and our hen and our lion. And Jesus is our lamb and our shepherd, who is close and who never leaves you alone. Amen.